since 2010, through Base Camp alone, we've trained and equipped over 500 college-bound Christians representing close to 75 different churches. We've planned and executed 10 camps, including a brand new work in Phoenix. I mentioned that earlier. And beyond that, the number of Christian professors and pastors and authors that have joined our teaching team has grown tremendously. And by the way, Joe, so I think that the first event was actually 2009. That was the dinner with Lee Strobel, but the first camp was 2010. Anyway, so our teaching team, I think, is our biggest asset besides the students. And as you can see, we have very strict criteria. So jokes aside, God has been really, really gracious to us in terms of helping us to identify the right topics and to link those topics with the right speakers at the right time. And it's not uncommon for us to invite Base Camp speakers to say a few words at dinners just like these on an annual basis. And I'm just curious, with a show of hands, how many of you have been to one of our dinners before, Faith Ascent dinners? Raise your hand if you have. Awesome. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. Again. And for the rest of you, this is your first time. Hope we're not scaring you away. But you may recognize some of these folks if you've been here before with us at the MAC or one of the other venues. I'm going to read to you a few quotes from past dinner speakers. Lee Strobel, author and speaker, said this. He said, "I don't even have a direct affiliation with Faith Ascent, but I want to tell you, it's where my heart is. We need to stem this tide. Our kids are vulnerable." Sean McDowell, PhD, professor, author, speaker, he said this: "A recent study showed that creating space for students to doubt and to ask questions is critical. Ministries like Faith Ascent take students seriously and help them to think through the answers to the big questions." Josh McDowell, author of More Than a Carpenter, Sean's dad, said this: "Every pastor has strengths and weaknesses. If you're smart, you accent your strengths and you supplement your weaknesses. I'm so encouraged by Faith Ascent's programs. I wish they would expand to other cities." He said that in 2010. And actually, I'm overdue for emailing him to let him know that we did expand to another city. And we have a third city that we hope to expand to. I'll tell you more about that later. You can read referrals. You can read endorsements from all of our speakers, other ministry leaders, pastors, folks in town. That's all on our website. I would encourage you to check that out. Talking about these speakers, it reminds me, I'm going to introduce Dr. Swamidass. Although Tony's going to formally introduce him, I must say a few quick things. So Josh and I first met in 2016, and we were at the Reasonable Faith Chapter meeting. Conway, where are you at? Conway? Yeah. So Conway hosts these Reasonable Faith Chapter meetings. That's for adults, apologetics related. And I met Josh there, and I learned that he was a professor at Washington University here in town. And I knew that I wanted to get to know him. I knew I wanted to talk to him. I wanted to ask him about what it's like as a professor from his point of view to see these Christian kids transitioning into a secular university, and I wanted to talk about it with someone who's actually in the trenches. So we shared a meal at a little restaurant in U City by his house, and I discovered that our churches couldn't be any more different. I discovered that our personal reactions to the riots in St. Louis were pretty different too. I used to live downtown. I discovered that our views on the particulars of creation were different. In many respects, I thought, Josh, that we couldn't be any more different. And I left the meeting just kind of pondering, all these differences and disagreements. And then I called him up and I asked him if he wanted to be a seminar speaker. And I asked him if he wanted to speak at Base Camp. And some of you are thinking, why? Why on earth would you do that? That's crazy if you disagree with all these things. Well, let me be clear. Josh and I agree on the essentials of the historic Christian faith. Don't hear what I'm not saying. And beyond that, Josh and I agree that students are better prepared for a university setting after they're exposed to a wide range of answers to a wide range of questions, while emphasizing sound hermeneutics, sound biblical exegesis, and the centrality of Jesus to our faith. I like having Josh at base camp because despite our differences, we agree that we need to teach kids, teenagers, how to think, not just what to think. Also, on a more personal note, I've watched Josh over the last couple of years take really big risks, personally and professionally, for Jesus. I've watched Josh respond with kindness when fellow Christians mistreated him and sometimes misrepresented his views. I watched Josh suffer well after losing a parent. I lost my mom in 2010, not long after one of these dinners. And I watched Josh suffer well after losing his dad. And I've watched Josh rejoice well, too. Josh recently got tenure at Washington University. Yes. After he came out of the closet as a card-carrying, Bible-believing Christian. That's pretty cool. And our students got to rejoice with him at base camp, and it was awesome. I really like Josh. I consider him a friend, and I hope he teaches at base camp for many years to come. And I'm pleased to have him here speaking tonight. So I'll let Tony introduce Josh more formally, but I had to say it, Josh. Thank you guys for listening to Dr. Swamidass.
Joshua Swamidass, MD, PhD. In addition to his internationally recognized work as Associate Professor of Laboratory and Genomic Medicine at Washington University in St. Louis, Dr. Swamidass was a featured speaker and panelist at Base Camp in both 2017 and 2018. He speaks regularly for Intervarsity Christian Fellowship and the Veritas Forum. He served as a science advisor to Concordia Seminary for AAAS Science for Seminaries and is a core member of the Carver Project. Dr. Swamidass' recent scientific work has built unexpected bridges between all sides of the origins debate by demonstrating that Adam and Eve, ancestors of us all, could have been created de novo out of nothing less than 10,000 years ago, deep in the Middle East. This work was presented along with a working theological model to attendees of the Dabar conference last summer. This brought high visibility to Dr. Swamidass, especially after Christian apologist William Lane Craig began a 2-year project on the science of the historical Adam interacting directly with Dr. Swamidass' work. We are truly honored to have him with us this evening. Please welcome Dr. Joshua Swamidass.
So thank you for having me here. It's really an honor and a privilege. It's not just an honor and privilege for me to be here, but it's also for you because I get to talk to you about one of the most important ministries that I've been involved with. And you're going to be invited to participate in it too. But I want to talk to you really about this core question, tell you more about Faith Ascent works and what I've experienced. This is like a picture from this last summer with all the kids there lined up in a college classroom. I know some of them are your kids and you think high schoolers like running around being rowdy. I tell you, these kids are not kids anymore. It's actually a little bit rude to call them kids because they're acting like adults. They're acting like college students and graduate students. They are engaged. And the question that I was wondering about when Jeremy asked me to come is this question, and that's the question I'm going to keep on coming back to over and over again through this talk. Because I think this question and its answer is going to help us understand, or at least help me explain what it is that I think is so important about what's happening at Faith Ascent. What is it that guards a student's faith? We've heard a lot of things going on in the world. We can see it too that make us a little bit concerned, maybe even a lot concerned. There's certainly a sense of fear that's behind the changes we see. And the question that rises, especially for me, like my father died, he's the one who's there, and then there's me, and I think about my son, right? Who is going to turn 3 soon. And I think through, what is going to protect his faith? Do you guys know what I mean? So before I get to that, I want to tell you a little bit more about myself. I'm a scientist and professor, and I'm a Christian. I'm a WashU. These are the first couple graduate students who just graduated, or are going to be graduating from my group or just graduated. I'm not a pastor. I'm not a missionary. I'm just an average scientist at WashU. Look, like I don't do this for a living. I'm just a humble scientist. We just go try and answer these like really mundane questions about the world. There's a small team of people that I work with and that I train. It's like a type of discipleship or apprenticeship over many years. And it's hard work. We answer questions that are important. And I got to this place with a lot of personal struggle, because I was raised in a context that taught me to fear the secular scientific world. And there was certainly a lot to fear there. And I just had to figure out how I was going to get a confident faith in the scientific world. And so when I was thinking about what I'm going to share with these students, I was thinking through, what is it that brought me to a confident faith in the scientific world? So I can enter into a place like WashU that is storied, that has been around for over a century, long before my parents came to this country, and where I have no power, and where people have more respect and are more studied and more intelligent than me. And what can I rely on that's going to give me confidence here? We tend to think about professors as the ones that are going to injure our children's faith, but what happens when you're the professor? And you know that you have no power, actually. Like I said, we do these things that really have really little to do with faith. Like what I do actually in my work is I build computer software to understand how drugs become metabolized. One of the big questions I'm wondering about is how to make drugs safer for children. You can think about that as like a great noble calling, and I do. I love it. I think it's amazing that God made me to do this, and so I don't want to knock it. But at the same token, it doesn't prepare you all of that education to answer this question of how to be in this context and have a confident faith. The other thing that I've been incredibly privileged to do is that every now and then I get pulled out of my lab and I get taken across the country by Veritas forums and other ministries to talk in secular contexts. This is me with Alan Lightman at MIT a couple years ago. He's the guy who wrote Einstein's Dreams. And it's a room full of students, and in Veritas forums it's usually about 50-50 Christian and non-Christian. And I'm here talking with an atheist. And to think through, there's nothing here to force them to think I'm giving a good idea, or they have no connection to me. I'm working from a deficit here. What does it mean to be confident in that context? Where does my confidence come from? What is it even, I wonder, as I look at these students and I talk to them, what is it that guarded my faith? I heard the gospel first, and I trusted in Jesus when I was very young, as a toddler. And like all of us, I'm prone to idolatry. I encounter the living God, and I turn to other things. So I'm not trying to say I'm perfect. The same token, somehow God protected something in me. And so I wonder, what is it that guarded my faith? And that was really what drove what I shared about here. This is the first time I spoke to the students here. And I'll just share with you briefly what it is, because I think it's important, because this is really not anything new. It is something that we know. It's just something that needs to be told over and over again in many different ways. It needs to become salient and more than just something that's known about, but something that's known in us. So I'm a scientist, so I talked about science, and I asked, what is the gospel, what is science, and which one is greater? That was my talk. What is the gospel? It is God's word to reveal himself in history through Jesus, this man Jesus, who lived, he died, he was buried, and according to prophecy, he rose again. And there was the empty tomb. This is all evidence in terms of things that were given by testimony to us and by prophecy. And by this act in history, where God actually makes himself known, where Jesus comes and he makes himself visibly known to people, they see him, and then I confess to you here, I didn't see him in the flesh, but I saw Jesus too. How many people here have seen Jesus too? Have you? There's that true experience we have where we know that there's this living presence in the world that is real, that is connected to this person in first century Palestine, and this is like the most confident thing we can know, right? I encountered him, and that's how I came to know that God exists, and he's good, and that he wants to be known. And I found that is the same gospel that Jesus talked about when he talks about the sign of Jonah. It's the same gospel that Peter talks about in Pentecost. It's the same gospel that Paul talks about in Areopagus. And I find myself in Areopagus. It's called WashU. And what is the science that we do at WashU? It's just a human effort to study nature. It's a human effort to study creation. And creation is beautiful, it's grand, and I love it. And I don't mean this to be disparaging. I mean, I've given my life to be a scientist. I find myself there. God made me for science. But science is merely the human effort to study nature. Every argument I've heard from science is merely people trying to explain by human reason something that God already demonstrated by his act in history. So I turn to the students. I ask them, which one is greater? And then we know what the Bible school answer is, right? You know what it is. In the same way how we can describe how to ride a bike before we actually do. But what happened in my life as I went through the challenging and dangerous path of becoming a scientist, as I came to really understand why it is true that Jesus is greater than anything I found in science. I got to tell your students that. And they heard me, and I think they saw something of Jesus too. And that, I believe, is the thing that will protect your students. That's the thing that will guard us. There's no argument that threatens him. Amen? Amen. I mean, it was a worshipful time. I talked to them about the one who was greater. And, I give talks in lots of contexts. Often, I'm not honestly that great of a speaker. There's times where I just say stupid things and, offend people. I don't always have a good handle on the room, but, I think there's something really beautiful that God is doing at Faith Ascent. There's like a readiness in those students. They come, they're being treated like adults, and they rise to it. And there's this reality that can sometimes happen that I don't think that Jeremy controls. I certainly don't, where the Spirit of God really comes. And I think that was something that I saw at Faith Ascent, where God was ministering and making himself known to these students. What guards a student's faith? This is my 3-year-old, or nearly 3-year-old Caleb. I think when I think about him, he is like a little one who is physically weak, mentally weak, emotionally weak, extremely emotionally weak. And the natural instinct when you see something weak is, especially when it's your flesh and blood, is you want to hold it close to you and you want to protect it. And he's had some bad injuries. He's been in the emergency room I think about 3 times this last year. I think he has at least one scar that's going to last until adulthood. And we just found out that he broke his front tooth in half. It's going to fall out, and he's going to. I mean, he's a very aggressive, accident-prone kid. He's too big, and so he's like physical. He gets on this bike, and you can see it's a tricycle, so that's safer, right? And I'm thinking ahead to like when he's older, there'll be a time when I'll have my hand on his seat when he's riding a bike, right? Now, what's the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is that he'll be able to go ride his bike without me there. So I do have to protect them. But at some point as he gets older, I have to let go. And in fact, I have to let him face the danger on his own. Because even though he might know mentally, and I can explain it to him, or he can even watch someone else ride a bike, at some point, he has to learn how to ride a bike on his own. And in fact, he might ride that bike different than me. And he might actually go to a place that I think is too dangerous. And he might find a better way than I would ever find. The reason why it's so terrifying when we see our students go off to college, there is stuff going on in culture, but part of what's going on is this is the moment where we're letting go. This is the moment where we are going to be, from this point forward, losing control over our children's lives, losing our ability to protect them, and they're going to choose their own way, and their way may be different and may be worse than ours. But still, that's our only hope for them getting a better way, a way that actually does better than we could do. So let me tell you what I've also seen happen at Faith Ascent. It's this place where I would say you're letting your children go into a place that's dangerous in all the right ways. Do you get what I'm saying? It's letting things happen there that maybe you wouldn't actually necessarily let happen if you were in the room. Or maybe your kids wouldn't let happen because they're not ready to do that. They need to do it on their own. I have to tell you, I've spent hours with these students answering questions, explaining to them my questions, engaging with them. And what they're experiencing there is Christian leaders that are not threatened by questions. I deal with atheists all the time right now, both through my public ministry and then also in science. There's a lot of atheists there. A lot of them have histories in the church. One of the most common reasons why they say they leave the church is they say the church is a place where questions are not welcome. They're the place where you have the answers, the questions aren't welcome. And in fact, questions are seen as a threat. I'm not saying all churches are that way. I'm not here to knock the church. I'm part of the church. This is the church. But that's what the experience is of many, many people that are that age. What I see at Faith Ascent is something different, where it's not like an insecure defensive grasp for simple answers. They're rather encountering a community of believers that their parents have no control over, really, that they have no control over, but that are unthreatened by their questions. I think the other thing you'll see here too, or they see here too, is that it's a community that is unthreatened by disagreement. I think what Jeremy's expressing in his incredible kindness to me and inviting me there when we had so much disagreement and so much kindness in his wonderful introduction to me and having me here is that there's something so important in the room that it wipes away the importance of all of our disagreements. You guys see that, right? Now, it's true that, in a practical context, in smaller churches, we sometimes have to have dividing lines along those things. We have like belief statements and stuff like that. But that's why what's happening at Faith Ascent is so important. It can't actually happen in a local church context alone. It's where we actually enter into the visible church, where there's that church down the road that maybe we disagree with, and they're sending members there too. And we find out that even though we disagree on things that are important, and maybe even those people across the way are actually wrong, that is not actually the most important thing. The most important thing is that we've all been transformed by the truth of this one who rose from the dead, the one who inaugurated a new kingdom that we have entered into, that we have all encountered Jesus, and he's reordered our entire worlds. So one thing that they do, which I think is extremely important, is juxtapose these conflicts and actually bring these conflicts to the surface. This is not a tame panel that happens on Faith and Science. There's a young earth creationist there. Kirk, where are you? Kirk, who's my good friend who I met at Concordia. And he's the pastor there, the theologian. This is an old earth creationist, intelligent design guy from Westminster. His name's Andrew Shaw. He's a philosopher there. A great guy. And we really disagree on just about everything in science. And it's bad when like the young earth creationist has to mediate. Yeah. And then there's me, and I'm not a theistic evolutionist, so I don't know really what to label myself. I mean, I say I'm not a theistic evolutionist because I think theism is with this unnamed God is like a dangerous concept. It's created a lot of problems in the world. But I follow Jesus, who's greater than theism. I'm not really an evolutionist. I mean, I definitely affirm evolutionary science. And now you're like, wait a minute. That was one of those disagreements. But let that go. I'm not here to convince you of that. But that's the whole point. Like, I don't want to call myself an evolutionist because my worldview does not rest on evolution. It rests on Jesus, who's greater than anything I've found in science. And so I get slotted into that category under protest, but I have no other better solution. And then there's me and my identity crisis, and the two of us, and we're going at it. And the students see a ton of important questions raised that are consequential and do not have any settled answers running out of it. But what they also see is they see three Christian men that have totally different backgrounds, totally different views, in genuine community with one another, in a community that is not a fake sort of peace, that isn't about, like, we'll just, like, be polite with one another. I mean, there isn't actually, we probably need to improve the politeness on that panel, and I'm probably the problem. But regardless, at least one of the problems. Kirk is definitely not a problem. All right. The key thing, though, is that's how family is, right? When you get with your family, that's when, like, the arguments come out. It's not always comfortable in family, but the reason why we're family is not because we agree with everything, but because it's real. And this is one of the ways we know that we encountered the risen Jesus, is because it brings us into family with people that would make no sense to be family with unless we encountered him. And I got to tell you, the other thing I've seen with these students, this is me talking to them afterwards, and I'm just telling you, I've talked to hours, and I got to know them, and I'm telling you, these are beautiful people. They're people that have taken the best that you've had to offer with them, and they're sifting through it all. But I'll tell you one thing that I see that makes me so excited, because it's forming, and you can see it forming in this next generation. We were worried about protecting them. But I got to tell you, I believe that they're going to find a better way than our parents. We have a lot of fears when we enter into this, but you know what? Jesus protects the church. I am a scientist. I'm in the scientific world. This is the world that everyone's afraid of, the secular scientific world. And I got to tell you that we see it as a threat to faith, but it's a community that Jesus loves. And when the church has lost its ability to communicate with them and been at war with them, I'll tell you what Jesus has done, what God has done. He's been there. He's made himself known to people, and what we call secular WashU or whatever university your kids go to, I just want you to know that God is there. Did you know that? And so when we think about what's going to protect the student's faith, we need to be thinking about how we get them connected to the one who goes to the places that you can't. I think a lot about my father this last year. He died in January. It was almost a year ago. This is a very precious photo that happened last Thanksgiving, just a couple months before he passed away. He was 70 years old. I think about how he was not a perfect person. He had a lot of problems, but he also had a true, genuine faith. And I think through, what is it about him that helped me find my way to a confident faith? I mean, because there's a lot of stuff that he did was wrong, and I can enumerate that. But there's also some stuff that he did right. And I think one thing that gives me hope is that when so much can go wrong in a family, that this can still go right. And I think part of what's going on here is that there's a new type of apologetic that I found. We tend to think about apologetics as a defense, and we kind of use the language of war at times. This has been an important image for me, that you see Jesus there in the garden with Peter with the sword. And what I'll tell you is that if we really know Jesus, we realize that he does not need a defense. The one who rose from the dead, the one that they murdered and took off the earth, doesn't need our help. And so sometimes we are fearful that the most important thing is being threatened, but the message of the gospel is that Jesus has already been given all authority. They've done the worst they could possibly do to him, and he still came back. And that's how I found confident faith. And there's this other definition of apologetics. You can say defense for apologetics, but another meaning that it has in Greek, apologia, it means explanation. I'll tell you what, Jesus does not need a defense, but he is something that is not of this world. I can't make sense of him to my colleagues who haven't seen him yet. He needs an explanation, and he can be experienced. And I tell you, that is what I see happening in Faith Ascent. They're getting an encounter in a different context that's cognitive, not just music, not just emotional, but it's introducing to the larger church community. And they're finding out that this thing in the room is not actually threatened. They can put their sword away. And when I think about what my father did and what I think can do is, yeah, it is a threatening time, but what's supposed to be different about us is we have a different sort of hope. We don't look to human power. Is that we're rather invited into the power of God in this moment. And so, yes, it completely is rational to be worried. It's completely rational to be thinking in the terms of defense, but I've come to a more positive apologetic where I realize that what's most important is not threatened here, and that's why I'm willing to risk my entire career to be public as a Christian, even before I had tenure, and to find a way to speak in that world. And by God's grace, they've treated me well. And I found out that there's a way to have a confession of Jesus in the secular world. So what guards a student faith? Now, I'm talking about Jesus all. I'm supposed to be talking about Faith Ascent, right? But I'll tell you what, the reason why Faith Ascent is important is because it points to something much greater than anything here. What I've seen there is God's blessing in this ministry. I've seen wisdom in its leaders, and I've seen the diverse community here of St. Louis, from churches from all over, come and put our most precious things in the same room to really be the invisible church together. And I think God is honoring this. I have been thinking for a while about what is my relationship to this ministry. I've been honored to be invited the very first time a year and a half ago. I was honored to be invited again this last summer. It is something, honestly, I hope you get a chance to visit sometime. I don't know, are they allowed to do that? Maybe find a way to just avoid your kid and go. So they can have some freedom, but it's something very special. These kids are getting up early in the morning, they're all day, and then they can't stop talking about what they're there. This is not like, you've probably never seen your kids like this. And God is meeting them in that world. Isn't that beautiful? Yes. So when I think about that, I have an honorarium check here. It's a fair honorarium. Jeremy's very kind. They make sure to treat us very well. I've gotten other honorariums from the last 2 summers. I've done things too. And, talking to my wife, I decided that actually, this is one of those ministries that even though it takes me away from my family, so it's like tomorrow I'm actually going to Hong Kong for a week. I was invited to talk about faith and science in China at a big university there. And pray for me on Monday. And so I'm probably going to have been pulling an all-nighter right now. This is not an easy time to be here. I am coming to a place of conviction on this is that I don't actually want to take honorariums from this ministry. So I'm giving this one back. So what I'm inviting you to do here is to join me in that. The invitation here is not to be fearful about what the future holds, but to understand that there's a new way of being forged here that will remove need for fear. This is your opportunity to participate. And I want to make sure that this sort of thing is the new way forward, so I'm going to be giving my resources and energy. I deserve this honorarium, but I'm giving it back. So I want you to, don't clap for me. No, what I want you to do rather than clap for me is I want you to really seriously think about taking good hard-earned money and giving it. Can you hear me on that? I just want to remind you that this is greater than even what's happening here. The reason why I care about this ministry is because it's not a ministry that points to itself. It points to that same thing that my mom pointed to when I was 3 years old when I heard the gospel. It points to that thing that's greater than anything I found in science. It points to Jesus, the one who rose from the dead. This is a ministry that's bringing children into the adulthood of the Christian faith. I was in graduate school for 9 years. If you count undergrad, that was 13 years. It's a long time. My entire 20s were in graduate school. And then I didn't leave. I ended up staying and becoming a professor. I've been in academia for a very long time. There's a need to introduce our students into something that's greater than youth group, into the larger Christian community. That this is one of those things. This is worth your time, your heart, your energy. You should send your kids to it. And you should give money here too. I mean, it's a privilege to do this. So thank you so much.
How do I know the Bible's reliable?
Christian sexual ethics are so outdated.
Are science and faith compatible?
That may be true for you, but that's not true for me.
Why would a good God allow evil and
All
suffering?
Christians are homophobic.
Were the disciples telling
All
the
religions
truth?
are
Is
the same.
Jesus
Oh,
really the Son of
Christians
God?
are
Is
way too
God mad at me for having doubts?